AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us here. Boy, we got some great topics to get into in today's show, especially these tariffs, which are supposed to hit just a couple of days from now. If you're watching this show live, if you're watching a tape, maybe it already happened. We've got Paul Eichenberg here, great consultant, analyst, really knows the industry well. We've got Perry Stern, too, really knows cars. And we'll be getting into some of the cars that we've been driving as well. But first, Gary, I'm sure, is going to try to stump us with one of his history questions.
All right. So as you recall, a few weeks ago, we talked about Peugeot and how it started in business with pepper mills and bicycles. And Opel actually started as a sewing machine company. Toyota, a weaving company. Okay. So there was a company founded on January 30th, 1920. Okay. January 30th, 1920. And it started out in 1927, it said, this business that we started out in ain't working out so well. So it became a machine tool manufacturer. Okay. And then a few years later, it decided, you know what? We really need to get into the auto industry. So in 1931, it manufactured its first vehicle. So this machine tool manufacturer becomes a vehicle manufacturer. And I'll even throw in another hint that the name we know it by didn't come to be official until May 1984. And this company was founded in 1920 on January 30th. Today's the anniversary.
The only thing I can think of is Toyo Kogyo, Mazda. Really? Is that's it?
You're
really?
absolutely right. So it started out, and see, I didn't want to say what it started out. It started out as a cork manufacturing company. Right. So its first name was Toyo Cork Koyo Company. And then it dropped the cork in 1927 when it became a machine tool manufacturer. Then in 1931, it made a three-wheel truck. It didn't make its first car until 1960.
Wow. And that was probably the Mazda 360?
It was the R360. Yeah.
R360. And that car is famous. And I swear to God, this is like something nobody knows. The stamping dies for that car. This was a little inky-dinky car with little inky-dinky fenders. The stamping dies were made out of ceramics.
Wow.
And very low cost, because this was a company, Mazda, that back then, Toyo Kogyo, that didn't have any money. So they figured out a way to make stamping dies out of ceramics. And
very delicate, I'd imagine.
I'm sure you had to treat them with
Press
care.
it very nicely, because otherwise, man, you just shatter one of those things.
Say, what's the crash rating on something like that?
Yeah, probably not very good.
But you know, I believe as a legal entity, Mazda's official name still is Toyo Kogyo.
No, they actually changed it.
Oh, they did change it? And Honda, somebody should look this up. Somebody in the chat room, you should look this up. Honda's official name is some crazy thing. It's not Honda.
Interesting. But
anyway,
on with the show.
Right. Okay. So, Paul.
Yes.
We brought you in here today because we want to talk about what is going to happen if these tariffs go through. And so everybody knows this right now, right? President Trump has threatened to put 25% import tariffs on vehicles and components coming in from Mexico and Canada. This is pressure he's putting on them because he thinks there's too much illegal immigration and too much fentanyl, very harmful drug coming in here. But the tariffs are supposed to go in on this Saturday, 2 days from where we're taping the show right now. What are you hearing? I mean, to me, this has disaster written all over it.
Yeah, well, I'm sure, the first place to start is, well, what happened in the last Trump administration when it came around this? And when you talk to the suppliers, one of the things they'll tell you is, well, it was a disaster for many of us. And part of the reason it became a disaster is because, for instance, you had an increase in the steel tariffs. And I had a client that had that 25% increase in steel tariffs. And steel, around the globe had sort of, capacity had been put in place to support the industry. So this particular supplier had a very strong position in North America, supplying all the OEMs, and then they were exporting, around the globe to other locations. And with the steel tariffs came in, the first thing that happened was they, go back to the customer and they say, hey, you got to pay this. And the customer said, well, we'll pay it for a certain amount of time, but you got to develop an alternative supply base. And then ultimately what they did is they start looking for a local supplier, but that local supplier had raised prices in line with where the tariffs would have put the pricing. So there was no relief there. And what ended up happening was the tariff stood for steel imports, but not the finished goods. So then what did the OEMs start doing? They started bringing finished goods in the same place because that's how they got around the tariffs. So eventually the supplier ended up losing market share where they had a very strong position because they had established this global supply chain. And ultimately, I think the goal of the administration is, hey, how do we create more jobs? But if you look at that as an example of what happened the last time, it didn't create jobs. It just raised prices for everybody in the ecosystem. And nobody came in and said, oh, well, we're going to put in new steel capacity, or we're going to put in new capacity for, these commodity products that are really have stabilized across the industry based on, the leanest value chain that they could establish before this up and down cycle that we've seen.
Mhm.
Did that have any effect on the whole U.S. steel situation that's going on right now, do you think?
Well, I do think it had an increase. It led to an increase in pricing. Okay, but there was not any new capacity that was really put in place. And I think that's the thing that you got to look at is ultimately, if you're doing this to create jobs, okay, what incentives are you giving the steel companies or those across the whole ecosystem to be putting more capacity in place? And I think and not suggesting one administration has done better than the other, but if you looked under the IRA, look at all of the new economy or new energy jobs that were put in place as far as batteries. There's now lithium being mined here in the US. This whole value chain is being created around the incentives that were there. If you're going to move, to tariffs and you're going to move, and change the emissions requirements. And if the idea is, we're going to protect jobs, we're going to do things, what are you doing to incentivize the companies that are in those value chains to do that? And I think that's where you start to see the challenge in this whole process is just that.
So what do you guys think? Are these tariffs going to go in this Saturday? Gary, what do you think?
Yeah, I think they will.
Yeah, Perry, you think so too?
I think they're going to put them through. I mean, it's hard to say exactly how they'll be implemented. And given, how some things have come out this week that have had immediate pushback, I don't know if that's the sort of thing that will affect what their final decision is on the tariffs.
Well, but the pushback thing was that arguably, or this is what they're arguing, that they were illegal, but the president does have the authority to put on tariffs. So the whole challenging it in court would not work.
True.
But I think the question becomes, before, they were putting these tariffs on materials, but now it's like everything coming in.
Yeah.
And so you look at General Motors and the number of vehicles that it produces in Mexico. Now,
I think one third of what GM sells in the U.S. comes from Canada and Mexico.
So how can it afford to deal with that? I mean, it's got to be devastating.
Well, and I think you saw their earnings announcement, earlier in the week. And one thing, when everybody asked them what kind of guidance you give, there's so much policy change that's, out there that's going to potentially impact us. and it hasn't settled down. We don't know which way it's going to go.
They didn't have an answer.
Yeah,
for
they
the
didn't have an
analysts.
answer.
And their stock took a hit
Yes,
because
and
of
the
that.
analysts were very upset with that. Oh no, you should be able to.
But I don't blame GM.
Yeah,
I mean, if
how
you
can-
don't know
how
what's
can
going to
they
go
know?
on,
Yeah,
how can you
agreed,
say, here's what
agreed.
we're going to do?
Agreed.
I mean,
But that's just going to carry on through the earnings calls that you're going to see from the suppliers. And I think some of the suppliers have already started to come out. Hey, when it comes to tariffs, that's being passed on to the OEM because I have no means in my system to be able to absorb all that cost. So this is going to be really hard on the OEMs. It's going to be tough on the suppliers as you go through this because of just the disruption. And, you've got to think about the supply base over the past 30 years is just focused on the idea. What's the leanest value chain can we create? This industry has really focused on no disruption. No disruption. We just continuously improve what we do day after day after day. When you throw this in here, you throw a wrench in everything. The suppliers are in complete disarray. The suppliers have to go through consolidation with the way things are in the industry. And it's going to hit the M&A market. It's going to hit the capital market as far as suppliers being able to raise capital because of just the uncertainty that all this puts in the system, at least for the next year or two, as these things start to get sorted out through, the legal system and Congress, et cetera, as you go through this.
Mm-hmm.
But Paul, what is the likelihood? I mean, you deal with suppliers all the time. I mean, what's the likelihood that they would be able to say to an OEM, oh, by the way, we're not paying that 25%? I mean,
well, I think right now, I think they've probably got a pretty strong voice because they're struggling. The suppliers in the market today are struggling. And if you look at the beginning of the last administration, what you had then was you still had powertrain suppliers that were making great margins. What's happened, over the past, several years since the beginning of the last Trump administration is you've had this steady increase around the globe of electric vehicles, and that electrical vehicle content. You've had suppliers who make traditional powertrain components and make great money. They've lost the efficiency in making powertrain components. The EV component volume's not high enough for them to really be making money. And as a result, this large population of suppliers are struggling to make money. And what are the OEMs trying to do? Oh, you got to help us bridge this this transition from, from traditional ICE to EVs. And as a result, who's absorbing a lot of that cost? Because there's just not the efficiency in the volumes. There's not the scale for EVs. It's the supply base. So the supply base isn't, going to be able to go back, go and say, well, we can absorb this, and I think that's going to be where the OEMs are going to be forced to really have to deal with this more so.
And does that mean that, as they have to raise prices, does it eventually come down to the consumer that prices are going to
eventually,
right? Because
immediately.
Ultimately that's what's going to be the result of, everything going up in price. It all comes down to the final payment.
Who's going to absorb it?
And it's likely to be the consumer.
Yes.
And look, we've already hit a position in pricing where the consumer is saying, no mas, I can't take it anymore.
Right.
And so if the average car today is retailing at about 50 grand, I'm going to say that the average factory price before destination charges, dealer market, let's just say it's 40 grand. A 25% increase or tariff is $10,000.
Yeah.
And that's just on average. And people say, well, that's only for the imported cars. And I'm going, you're living in la la land. They're all going to raise their prices. They just are. So, for example, Toyota makes the RAV4 in Canada, best-selling Toyota in the United States. Honda makes the CR-V in Canada. If they go up by $10,000, what do you think Ford's going to do with the price of the Escape? What do you think GM's going to do with the Equinox? They're all going to raise their prices.
Yes. So again, I go back to it from a standpoint of, well, what are you trying to do with the policy? And ultimately, how are you going to incentivize people to create jobs here in the US? And that's why if you look at a sort of a comparison, that Biden model, which was, hey, you know what? And I know people don't like the fact that EVs are being shoved down their throats, but you're building this whole ecosystem to be able to support that industry in a very different manner, which, again, is just a very, it's just a different approach. But I think this ultimately, we're in this time of this polarization. And if you think of the traditional supplier and the OEMs, what they've gone through from the beginning of the Obama administration, they're the first to really issue the emissions regulations. You had CARB come forward and say, hey, we're going to start driving our own requirements. And then you have Trump come in who, tries to freeze all of that and try to reverse the CARB mandate. Then you have Biden come in and he increases it, and now you come back. And this is a real difficult time for people to operate in the industry where you're, hey, this continuous improvement mindset, is always what we have that we're trying to do. And the hard part is that this shift with, the Trump administration is going against what the rest of the globe's doing. So if you think of those European, those Asian OEMs, and even if you look at commercial vehicles, all the commercial vehicle OEMs are driven out of Europe now because Navistar is now owned, by Scania and the Traton Group and VW Group. So you have this polarity that's taken place in the industry that says, how do I manage a business in this environment? I mean, think of GM. GM sells as many vehicles in Asia as they do here in the US. Asia, their whole market's going towards EVs. What do we do? So this polarity is really creating a challenging time for the OEMs and the suppliers in this ecosystem.
With the incentives that were put forth for the electric vehicles, to incentivize the manufacturers to get the resources in America, build the batteries in America, do all, is that going to somehow make electric cars become more on an even playing field because those may not be as susceptible to tariffs if everything is being built here?
Yeah. So, and I think that's that's something that's yet to be seen, is the market pull with all the all the new models coming out. Will the market continue to shift that way on their own, minus the incentives? We've done a lot of work in the commercial vehicle space, and one of the things I can tell you is the incentives on commercial vehicles are just nowhere near where they need to be able to get the scale. I mean, if you look at Class 8 truck, $180,000, $200,000. Well, if you make it an EV right now, it's $400,000 or $500,000. So, and there's not enough incentive in that, but the market has to do something to bridge this gap. How do you get scales to be able to drive those type of vehicles into the market is really a question there. It's not that big of a gap when it comes to EVs and the internal combustion engine. We're really getting to a point in time where there's more of this parity between the two. So that's not as big of a gap to measure and manage versus what you have, like, for instance, in commercial vehicles. So, it's all going to come down to what kind of policy can you drive to really get that point where we have a tipping point. Now we've got enough volume and scale for people to start making real money when it comes to at least light vehicles.
So Perry, let me ask you, I mean, you drive a lot of cars, and so let's say the $7,500 goes away, and basically if someone wants to go out and buy a vehicle, they have to make a choice of whether they want to, I mean, as John pointed out, average transaction price $50,000, and
Right.
EVs are about $6,000-7,000 above that, right? Now, if the mandates go away, if the tax credit goes away, what are people going to buy?
I think there are still people that are going to want EVs. I mean, there are certain qualities about EVs that make them really desirable. They're great to drive. They can be very efficient. They can save you a lot of money depending on how you use it. I mean, for example, if you typical commute is 30 to 40 miles a day, for most EVs, you can go all week and then charge them up for, at lower times, when electricity is a little less expensive. And so you can end up saving considerable money. So you still have to do that equation to see, does it make sense to, versus a gas vehicle. So if you're looking at, say, Equinox EV versus an Equinox, the Equinox EV is going to be more expensive, but over time, you have to do the math and see if it's going to balance out, even without the tax credit.
So back to the tariffs for a minute. Who's the CEO of Linamar, the Canadian company? Linda Hassenfratz. I'm butchering her name, but she was quoted in Automotive News as saying, "Look, if this 25% tariff hits Canada and Mexico this weekend," she predicted that North American production would go for about a week, and then everything would come to a crunching stop. Do you think that could happen?
Well,
Gary?
and this is because of the components that go back and forth across the border as it gets processed. And so if you have to do all this administrative work, that, yeah, it's going to be a real problem to do that and to do the calculations and to try to figure all of that out. And if companies then just decide, geez, we can't ship, then where are the parts going to come from? And this gets back to what you're saying, Paul, about how they built a network in order to produce things. I mean, I think that maybe many people, many of whom are probably in Washington, just imagine that things get made, right? And there it is.
Well, but
And
you
like
think
magic.
about, you think of the supplier that I was talking about earlier. I mean, they make simple components, but the complexity of, you got to get a specialty steel, and that specialty steel, I can only get in a couple locations. And then they go out and they bid it to say, hey, where am I going to get the best price? And, my local supplier of the steel already has capacity that is spoken for others. So, we're going to buy it from France, and then it gets shipped in. And then the next thing you know, you've got a cost on top of that just makes you uncompetitive. And then the OEMs are moving, we got to change our supply base. Because somebody can still buy that French steel, but now they can make the end good, and bring it here. Now, I understand that components aren't going to go back and forth like they did maybe the last time, but everybody has worked to build this efficiency into this ecosystem. And it just is going to be a real challenge.
To paraphrase an old saying, a supply chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And, you break one part of it and it all unravels.
Yes.
Yeah, we've been talking about tariffs in Canada and Mexico, but I mean, the talk of it is that Trump is going to put an import tariff 25% above what we've already got, the 2.5%, on everything, including from Europe. And so Volkswagen is reportedly looking at building Audis and Porsches at its assembly plant in Tennessee. What do you think, Perry? How long would it take them, do you think? Or it's going to take a while.
No, it's clearly not an easy thing to do. I mean, it takes years to get it up to production. So, I mean, by the time they're able to do it, is it already too late? It makes sense to start thinking down that road, but you still have all of the parts are going to still be coming in. You're still going to have the effect of the tariffs, no matter. I mean, even the car, like Subaru builds most of its vehicles in Indiana, but all the parts are coming in from around the globe, and so it's still not immune from all the tariffs.
Yeah.
So Paul, let me ask you. So, I mean, the last time we had you on the show, which was years ago, when we talked about Powertrain, and you pointed out that the move was towards electrification, and that conventional ICE was on the way down. Let's say that because of the unleashing the energy, or whatever the policy was that Trump signed, that talked about drilling and using oil and on and on and on. And let's say that the internal combustion engine comes back in a big way. I've got to believe that many of the supplier companies have reduced their capacity in reducing capacity, meaning like maybe they sold the plant off and the equipment's gone. They,
Yeah.
I mean, how long does it take to ramp back up?
Well, I think so. So obviously, we follow a lot of the M&A market, and a lot of the work we do is with PE firms who are always looking to buy these type of powertrain assets. And what does the consolidation of that look like? And what I would tell you is many suppliers have gone through reduction of engineering resources around powertrain, because now what you have is nobody's building new engines in transmission platforms. They're not building new transfer cases, these type of things. They're really planning for that all electric future. I mean, as soon as you guys realize the last Trump administration ended, Mary Barra came out and said, hey, we're planning for an all electric future, and it starts in 2035. And they've been marching to that. They do not have really any hybrids. It's either EV or it's ICE. So now what is that supply base done? Hey, we're not getting RFQs for new engines. We're not getting RFQs for new transmissions. Haven't been for 5-6 years. The only RFQs we get is when somebody else folds up and the OEM's got to come in and do something proactively. So there isn't the supply base that's going to be there, nor is the OEM going to come out and say, hey, wait a minute, for the North American market, we're going to start making new engines or new transmissions. They just don't have the investment, there's not the resources. So the industry has really started to shift more and more towards this. And I think that's the hard part, is where do you get the resources to go back from where the industry sees as its future, which isn't just electric, but connected cars and the whole architectures that those new cars produce and advantages that produces for the consumers. That's where the industry's been pushing. That's where China's pushing it. That's where Japan's pushing it. That's where Korea's pushing it. That's where Europe's pushing it. So I haven't been able to figure out yet here, mostly we make trucks and SUVs. They're designed and developed here. I haven't been able to figure out, is this, just niche, what we're going to be in this market? I haven't been able to figure out, well, what does this mean overall? But I don't see OEMs coming out and saying, hey, we're going to design a new engine or a new transmission at this point in time. I just don't see that happening.
So we're getting down to the end of this segment. What are the chances of Trump saying, okay, Canada, Mexico, I see you're making improvements on cutting down on illegal immigration. I see that you're really taking some serious steps to block fentanyl from coming into the United States. Okay, I'm not going to put the Trump tariff on. What are the chances of that?
Oh, I think it's low.
I was going to say very low. Yeah.
I think
Okay,
it's very low.
then what are the chances of him saying, okay, we're going to do 25%, but it's not going to fall this Saturday. We're going to give you guys a number of months. We're going to phase it in over time. Does that help at all?
I don't think it helps at all.
And I don't know that it would happen.
Yeah.
I mean, I could see it going the other direction where, I said I'm doing a tariff Saturday, I'm doing it Saturday, but, in 6 months, quietly lowering it down, perhaps.
Yeah, let's face it. I mean, we are all talking here about, hey, the last time the tariffs came in, it raised prices, it raised inflation, and he really stuck Joe Biden with that. Okay, but that all started, under the last Trump presidency. So I think he is going to go forward with it no matter what, because he thinks at the end of the day, the people who are voting for me don't see this cause and effect. And what I'm telling them, by us doing this, this is going to create jobs. And I think that's the most important message for the presidency at this point in time. And, showing a strong face to, hey, this is how we treat, the rest of the globe in this environment, because we got to take care of ourselves. So I think that message is more important than, hey, what is the impact of this going to be over the next 3-4 years,
Mhm.
especially when you got a single presidency?
Okay, quick question.
Yeah.
Is it going to create jobs?
I don't know that it is, because the last time I don't think it created jobs. There was no new capacity added. You know, if we go back to the steel, nobody was building new steel mills. Okay, so I don't know that that created jobs.
Well, we're going to have a lot to talk about next week's show because we'll have a somewhat clearer picture of what's going on. Let's take a quick commercial break right now. We'll be back in a moment to talk more about the automotive industry.
Performance that shines, even in the rain. That's what really matters. Bridgestone Potenza tires, improved grip in wet conditions.
All right, we're back. We got a lot to talk about.
This is probably the longest we've gone on the show and not talked about Tesla.
Well, before we get into Tesla, because that's a good topic, Perry, you drive a lot of cars. What have you been driving this week, or what media events have you been out? What's good out there that you like?
Well, this week I'm driving a GMC Terrain, which is all new for 2025. It's really good. It's a compact crossover, 5-passenger, but it's got a ton of space inside. It looks really good. It's got that same look as the rest of the GMC lineup. Got 31 miles per gallon driving over here today with a non-electrified powertrain.
It's what, a 1.6 turbo?
A 1.5, I think.
Okay.
1.5. But it's got plenty of power. It's efficient. Took it out, found some snow yesterday, a little bit in a parking lot where no one had plowed it yet. And so it's a great idea for a vehicle like that. It starts around $30,000 for front wheel drive, $2,000 more for 4-wheel drive. Right now, because it's the new model year, it's only available in what they call the base model, which is the Elevation, I think. But it's big screen inside, everything's digital. It feels very high tech. It feels like a much higher level car. So it's impressive.
How about you, Gary?
Well, last week I was out in San Diego driving the new Toyota 4Runner.
And this is like the first redo of the 4Runner in a couple of centuries.
And forever,
right?
yeah, I was going to say.
Approximately 2.5 centuries since they did that. It was interesting. I mean, I spent time talking to the chief engineer, who is a Japanese man who lives in Japan, lived in the U.S. for a while. And he also was chief engineer on Land Cruiser. And I guess I hadn't realized that there are 3 variants of the Land Cruiser. There's the 300, the 250, and the 70. And the 70 is like the real, like if you're, on a safari in Africa or something, like real grunty car and then it goes higher and higher in tech. But he was talking about the love that exists for that particular vehicle and how very important it is. And it's a body on frame still. And I asked him about that because if you look in that segment, you can't find vehicles that are body on frame anymore. And he basically said, you know what, this is part of Toyota-ness. This is where we began, and we're going to, this is something about us. And I just thought that was so refreshing to hear.
Well, yeah, but I mean, that's a response to the customer. The customer wants body on frame for a Land Cruiser, no question about it.
And for the 4Runner.
Yeah,
and
but it's a small number of customers that want a body on frame for the Land. I mean, they don't sell a lot of those. I agree, though, that having it, paying attention to its loyal customers is important. And a lot of manufacturers have kind of forgone that they can do volume. So why build this kind of niche car that, lots of people, remember from a long time ago and love it, may not even buy it. They just love the idea that they're building it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that was, so as you guys know, that on press drives, we often have the opportunity to do all kinds of silly things that we probably wouldn't otherwise do. And then in the case of this, we were on this ranch and they had us basically jump the car. So we had all 4 wheels in the air. And of course we had a driver or a expert sitting in the right seat, explaining what we needed to do, and he's like, go 31 miles an hour. do not, do not go faster, do not go slower. You must be at 31. Watch the speedometer, and it's just like, whoo, and quite an experience. What have you been driving?
Well, wait, just so on the 4Runner, if you're jumping the truck, does it have those spool valve shock absorbers?
That made it feel really nice.
Well, when you hit the ground, I mean, I think you need those things. I just wonder if they're putting that in the 4Runner now.
I believe they do have those in there.
Okay.
But they do, and so it shares a lot with the new Tacoma, but it doesn't have that clever seat that we saw when we were out at the Toyota Technical Center.
Right. So this week I've been in a Mazda CX-90.
That's the big one.
It's the big one. It's all-wheel drive. It's got the inline 6-cylinder engine. Drives beautifully. The interior is really interesting because Mazda is, I guess I'll use the term warmed it up. It actually has fabric in the instrument panel. I mean, like cloth. And it's got this interesting stitching to it as well. And Mazda has been an interesting company for me to watch because I like their products. I think they're very handsomely designed. They look good. I think they drive terrific. They err on the side of enthusiasts, which I include myself to be one of. And I've always been puzzled as why don't they sell better? Good-looking cars, well-priced, drive beautifully, blah, 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 blah. And last year, it looks to me like they turned the corner, at least in the U.S. market. Sales are starting to look pretty good for Mazda right now.
Maybe too many people associate them with corks or machine tools.
Maybe they do.
That's the problem.
Maybe they do. Okay. Tesla.
All right. So they came out with their numbers yesterday?
Yeah.
Yesterday.
Yeah, last night.
Okay. So Paul, I want you to listen to these numbers because I want you to explain to me whether this is a sign of something or if I'm getting ahead of my proverbial skis here. Okay. Auto revenues down 6%. Operating expenses up 18%, income from operations down 20%, adjusted EBITDA 0, total production down 7%. How's that look? So let's say you didn't even know what the company was, and I gave you those numbers. What would you say?
So I would say that's a typical OEM.
That's a typical
legacy OEM.
That is a legacy OEM. And I think, what they're dealing with is now the hundreds of vehicles that are now EVs in the market that have that are software-defined vehicles, that have the features, that have the comforts that people really appreciate in a Tesla. And so I think competition is only going to continue to erode that share that they have. Now, if they can continue to introduce new technology like the full self-driving, maybe that's going to create barriers for others to compete. But I think even if you look at BMW coming out with more models, as people come off leases for Teslas, are they going to be buying another Tesla, or are they going to say, well, we've got so many other options. We now can put ourselves in a Mercedes, a BMW, a Cadillac, whatever it may be. And I think that's really their challenge going forward is how do they continue to grow?
But from a business, are these numbers?
No.
They're not great.
No, they're not.
They're not great, but the stock went up on the news.
Yeah.
And so I look, I've been saying this for years. Don't bet against Tesla. Don't bet against it. Yes, these numbers look like legacy, and I think their profit margin was like 7% or something like that.
7.5%.
I mean, I think their operating margin, GM beat them. General Motors beat them on the operating margin. But there's several positives in there. Their energy storage business is growing by leaps and bounds. It was up like 67%. They did over $10 billion in revenue. Their services, which include insurance and finance and spare parts and the like, was up like 27%, $10.5 billion. Their ZEV credits that they sold were like $2.5 billion, up like 54%. I'm going off the top of my head, which I shouldn't do, but so all strong. And then Elon drops a couple of bombshells during the analyst call. They're going to launch unsupervised FSD level 4 in Austin, Texas. They're going to start tests this year with a view to doing more later in the year. And he announced they're going to start mass production of their humanoid robot, Optimus. And the market for that could be overwhelming.
Yep.
And I think the analysts or the investors ignored all the bad legacy car company-like numbers and focused on this level 4 unsupervised and on the Optimus robots and went, woo, good time to buy.
Mhm.
That's my read of it.
But isn't that been pretty typical for Tesla in the past? I mean, as sales drop or they have issues over here, but look, we have this new Roadster over here, or look, we have this new truck. It's
a
like,
shiny, bright
look,
object.
squirrel.
Right. That's right.
And everybody goes with it. It's exactly what you just described.
Yeah.
And so I think but to your point, the number. I mean, it does make sense that they were the only game in town for a long time, and they have. I mean, when you look at a Model S right now, it's not all that much different than that first Model S. I mean, there's been some style changes, things like that, but in order for any car company to remain competitive, you've got to reinvent it, but you've got to redo it.
To Paul's point, let's say most people probably lease a car for 3 years, typical lease. Now somebody coming out of their 3-year Tesla lease this year goes, oh God, those BMWs, to your point, look great. That Cadillac Lyriq, I like that.
Yeah.
And if you're in a market like California where Teslas are everywhere,
Right.
a lot of people, upscale especially, are going to say, you know what, I don't want to be driving what everybody else is driving.
Right. So I was reading the Tesla deck that went along with the numbers, and one of the slides was a comparison of the existing Model Y and the new Model Y. Okay, and it's, of course, the new Model Y has got all kinds of checks because it's got all this new cool stuff, right? And so this is their comparison. Okay, and then I noticed, well, wait a minute, there's this really fine print on the bottom here, and so I blew it up and see what it said. So it says, Model Y rear drive starts at $46,630, and new Model Y launch series long range all-wheel drive starts at $61,630. So we're basically talking, about 20 grand. Price includes destination and order fees, but excludes taxes and all other fees, subject to change. New Model Y launch series has upgrades that will increase the price. Estimated savings includes $6,000 in gas savings, estimated over 5 years, and the $7,500 federal tax credit available to eligible buyers
For now.
So I mean so Terry, sorry, it's got your 2 points: the gas savings and cost savings related to. But do you think
you're going to but you're not going to have all of that possibly?
Yeah. I just wonder if this isn't indicative of as we've said, like traditional car company business rather than the special company that it's long been.
Well,
I think it has become a traditional car company.
The investors don't look at it that way. In fact, they don't even look at Tesla as a car company. They look at it as an AI/robotics company. And that's why the market valuation is where it's at. And why legacy car company numbers didn't put a dent in the stock price. It did initially for the first couple of hours after trading. It was down and then boom, bounced right back.
There are a couple types of analysts that cover them. So Morgan Stanley's, very bullish because they're sitting there saying, well, with Optimus alone, that's a game changer. So you have that side of the equation. As a traditional automotive analyst, then you have other automotive analysts like at Wells Fargo who's like, yeah, this is a traditional car company. Forget all that shiny stuff. Here is how this is performing as a car company. And I think people have to decide, for themselves, hey, is this a good investment, based on the shiny stuff, or do I buy into, no, as you increase competition, they're just not going to be able to, sustain this stock price. I think that's the decision that people need to make, as they're thinking about the stock.
So Perry, one of the things that Elon said in his call was that he would have this self-driving service in Austin, Texas sometime this year, and that at some point in the not too distant future, it would be possible for Tesla owners to put their cars into the fleet so they could basically do an Airbnb with their vehicle. what's the likelihood of any of the above?
There's so many obstacles to level 4. I mean, we're not even to level 3 driving, where you can, take hands, be hands free and not pay attention to the road. We're level 2, which is not that uncommon now, where with Super Cruise and for Blue Cruise, where you still have to pay attention. You take your hands off the wheel, you take your feet off the pedals, and it does everything very well. But to get to level 4, which I believe means you don't even have to be in the front seat, you can be. I mean, it's a major step that there are accidents, weather conditions, things like that I'm not sure that they're able to deal with that yet. So I'm not holding my breath.
Well, then Waymo announced that it's going to begin testing in 10 more cities. Now, it isn't going to be putting service in these 10 cities, and it's only going to be sending 10 or fewer vehicles into these 10 markets. But it seems that that's a company that is really aggressively going after this level 4.
Well, the thing that amazed me about,
I guess is that level 5?
No, level 4.
Level 4. But Waymo's, when you look at the cities where it's going into, or the regions it's going into, one of them was the Upper Peninsula of Michigan.
I saw that.
Really?
One of them was upstate New York. So I find that now they're going to have drivers driving them.
Mm-hmm.
Then the next step is going to be a safety driver monitoring. But then the next step after that is going to be take the driver out. Well, what I find fascinating about this is, I mean, you guys know, but maybe a lot of the audience doesn't know, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, very rural, remote, brutal winters. Same with upstate New York, very mountainous, very snowy. So I find it fascinating that Waymo is saying, okay, boom, we got to make this work there.
So, yeah, and I'm curious on, well, why would you think they chose those areas? Because they're not going to get a lot of, taxi type service, in those areas. So why do you think they chose those?
Because I think they're looking way down in the future where, in rural areas where you've got a long distance to travel, maybe robo-taxis make more sense there than in, say, like a crowded city.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, too, in rural areas like the Upper Peninsula of Michigan or upstate New York, rural areas tend to be lower income areas. And maybe you can offer this robo-taxi service at a price that looks very attractive to these people.
Mm-hmm.
And look, Waymo started in Phoenix, really, because it's sunny, it's warm, there's no snow to worry about, the roads are all straight. So they picked an easy area. And now I think that they've got enough mileage under their belt, so to speak, that they're saying, let's go after some of the tougher ones, because if we can crack that nut, we've just opened our business plan up into a lot more opportunity. They're also going to Tokyo, by the way, so leaving the U.S. and going there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, you just think about driving in the Upper Peninsula. I mean, it's 2-lane roads. In the winter, you're basically have solid walls of snow on the side of you, and so things that autonomous vehicles use, like side markers and things like that, you're not going to be able to see those. So if they're able to solve that and be able to drive under those conditions, maybe they won't even go up there, but they'll say, hey, Minneapolis, it snows a lot there, and let's be putting cars there with high level of confidence that it's going to work out.
But I think some of that is those vehicles train themselves as far as where are they at in the road. So the repetitive miles become very critical when you get in those conditions where you don't see the lane markers and you don't see the road as clearly. So that repetitive nature is really critical. The UP is a huge, area to cover to be able to do that. So I'd be really interested to understand, what's sort of the algorithm around the idea of, well, how long do they have to be there before they have that level of confidence?
Yeah.
So speaking of Super Cruise, as we just did, So Mary Barra said this week during the earnings call that they expect Super Cruise to bring them $2 billion a year in revenue by 2030. As we recall a few years ago, that number was a lot higher for autonomous vehicles, and now it's been rationalized some, I think. What is the likelihood, Paul, do you think that they'll hit 2 billion?
I think, so as you were talking about, as you get into these, sort of 2+ level 2 plus type of features, if you're doing highway driving, that is a great feature to have. The fatigue that you have, like to drive to Chicago. So, I took the family to Chicago a couple weeks ago, and to do 4 hours in the car with those type of features, it's just, it makes the trip go by so much better. And I think people who drive that type of way, even occasionally, will start to say, this is really a much better way of doing this. So I think when it comes to those level 2 plus type of features, I think there's going to be a strong pull in the market that once you get that in front of people, and I may not be sitting here for 5 minutes at a time with my hands off the steering wheel, but the fact that I don't have to have my eyes on the road, all the time is just so much easier. And I think people will start to see that and will really start to take to those features.
It'd be interesting because there's also people like my wife who scared to death of it, doesn't trust it, doesn't even like it when I use it in the car. And it's, and it may be an age thing, I'm not sure, but it's, there are certain people that just will never trust that the vehicle can do all that on their own. But, and it's funny, I remember when they first started talking about autonomous driving, and in my head, I'm thinking, I love driving. I don't want to ever give up the driving. I think it's the coolest thing ever. To be able to get on the freeway. I mean, I picked up a vehicle at the airport, drove 30 miles on the freeway home without ever touching the pedals or the steering wheel. It changed lanes on its own. It passed other cars. It was easy and relaxing.
Look, I love driving too. I'm a hardcore enthusiast. What, stop and go traffic, or just, going straight on a freeway for hours on end? No, I'm ready to let the car do it.
So to what extent are people going to be willing to pay a subscription fee for something in their vehicle like a Super Cruise? I mean, in some ways, SiriusXM has proven that people will pay for something that had long been free, radio, right? But so here's a recurring charge that you're getting on your credit card, or a recurring charge that is in your car loan. Is this going to be acceptable, or is there going to be a sufficient amount of churn such that they're really going to have to work hard at getting people to initially get it and keep it?
I mean, I think they're smart about the fact that most of the new vehicles you buy have a couple year trial, so you get them hooked, because, like you said, it is a wonderful thing to have, and for a lot of people, it's worth spending a little bit more to have that feature. So I think people will pay it, especially if they get addicted.
Well, Mary had a specific number too, because they've been giving it out for free for X number of time. And then what she said is 20% say, yeah, I'll continue paying for this. So if GM sells, 4 million vehicles, 20% is 800,000. You're knocking on the door of 1 million people a year paying this. I could see it happening. And right now it's been introduced on premium products, Denali's, Cadillacs and thing. What's Hyundai going to charge when it offers this kind of level 3 plus or level 3 driving? They'll probably offer it at a much lower price point. And
if they didn't have the deal with GM, I'd say they'd offer it for $0.
Right. Hey, speaking of GM, one of the other things that I found in their financials that they just announced this week was they paid damn near $1 billion buying out Buick dealers who didn't want to sell EVs. And I was astonished at that number. It was like $940 or $960 million. But but I had no idea that they were still going through that. I don't know what do you think, Perry?
I mean, I could see Buick dealers, not wanting to make the investment into going EV. What I'd be curious to know, though, is what percentage of the Buick dealers went away. I mean, how many? There weren't. I can't imagine there aren't a lot of Buicks being sold in America. I mean, comparatively speaking. So I'm curious to know, how many of them was this an out that they were looking for?
Yeah, and I don't know why it singled out Buick dealers. I mean, Cadillac selling electrics. I'm sure there's Cadillac dealers who say, I don't want this, and Chevrolet is doing it, and I'm sure there's Chevrolet dealers.
But I think with Buick, you have a number of rural, sort of dealerships that are just like, hey, you know what? I'm set up to take care of an internal combustion engine. You want me to pay more? You want me to do more with this? I think that's where you start to get the rub, for brands like Buick. Cadillac tends to be much more, suburban, city type of individuals. And I think that's what you start to look at when you start considering, well, why would this happen with Buick? But all the OEMs have this issue. I think Ford a year or so ago came out and said, hey, you know what, we're going to the agency model when it's EVs. And there was somewhat of a revolt with the dealers, which they started to soften on that. So this disruption isn't just hitting, General Motors and Buick. It's going to hit that whole car side of the dealership model, I think.
Well, a couple weeks ago, this firm Kerrigan Advisors, which deals with dealerships and their consultants to dealerships, did a study, and in reading from Kerrigan Advisors, one of the most striking findings of the survey is the concern surrounding new electric vehicle sales. A significant 77% of dealers expect EV sales to negatively affect profitability in 2025, citing challenges such as higher costs and an evolving consumer base. In contrast, hybrid vehicle sales and parts and service operations are seen as key growth drivers, with 77% and 75% of respondents respectively expecting these areas to boost earnings. So if you got 75% of the dealers saying EVs are going to not be good for us.
Well, I think so. I have another data point. We did a project in the commercial vehicle space, working with the OEM and their dealers to understand, hey, what is the impact as you start to shift to all these new technologies? And for the traditional commercial vehicle, Class 8 trucks, Class 6 trucks, that whole market for commercial vehicles, 65% of the profit that they generate comes from, supporting the internal combustion engine. Some truck drivers going across country, he's got a breakdown, he's got to come in, and they take care of that. And that's where their profits are made. And they're all sitting there saying, wait a minute, when you go away from the internal combustion engine and you go to EVs, you don't have anywhere near the parts, the service, the requirements. How am I going to make money in this where I've built a business around this traditional model? So I think, that's not only on the commercial vehicle side, that's on the traditional automaker dealer model also, which I think becomes really a challenge. And then you start looking at Tesla. Well, we really don't even have dealerships. That's the other thing that all these dealers are looking at. Hey, this change, what does it really mean for me? And I think that's where the rub starts to become the uncertainty.
It makes sense also then that hybrids would be less of a concern, because you still have all of the internal combustion, and you still have all the same service.
Well, and you have dual,
True.
powertrains. So you've got an EV, which now has new maintenance requirements. You've got traditional ICE, so for them, there's a lot more that could go wrong with a traditional hybrid.
Well, what I wonder about is Perry, going back to your example of the Equinox EV and the Equinox. So, somebody goes into their local Chevy dealer and there's these two vehicles, and the dealer's thinking to himself, I'm going to lose dough if I sell this Equinox EV. So I'm going to tell the consumer they really want the Equinox.
It is possible. I mean, I don't know if the salespeople are looking that way. I mean, yes, as far as terms of service, they are going to make more money, I would imagine, on the.
Well, see, I see it somewhat different. If there's an Equinox EV on the lot, the dealer bought it from the factory. The dealer is financing that. The dealer's losing money every single day that it's there. You got to sell it. If somebody comes in and is interested, you bet I'm going to try to sell them into this EV.
Okay,
but if they have to order it, then no, I'm going to sell them what's on the lot.
Okay, so what if they come in and they're just looking? They don't care one way or the other.
Then the typical salesperson will steer them towards a nice vehicle.
Again, going back to the commercial vehicle side, a huge disruption in that market is the typical salesman sits down. All those trucks have been spec'd over the years for all those fleets. So you got a small fleet, medium-sized fleet, large fleet. They know what they need and how to spec those vehicles. So you come into that dealership, if you're buying 5, 6, 10 trucks, whatever it is, what colors, what cab do you need, etc. Now you start to introduce an EV. You've got infrastructure needs. You've got whole different, requirements around, towing and everything. It becomes such a sophisticated sale. Most brands, the OEM has to be involved in that sale because of speccing that vehicle, and it's so different. So you go to a whole different sales type of model to introduce a commercial vehicle EV versus what you do, your standard diesel Class 8 truck. So there's a lot of change that comes when you start to introduce EVs in the commercial vehicle space.
Yeah. All right, last question just for you two, because we talk about this all year long. So, okay, here we're at the beginning of the year. What do you think sales will be like in 2025? More than last year, same as last year, or less than last year?
I think it's going to be less than last year. If we look here in North America, I think it's going to be less. And I think it could be less globally because we are about to deal with a big disruption. I think we're all in somewhat alignment. The tariffs are going to happen. If it's just to send a message to the globe. As a result, that disruption is going to create a challenge when it comes to the number of vehicles that you're going to sell. So I think it's, I think it's going to be less.
And I have to agree. I mean, coming back full circle to the tariffs, we don't really know exactly what's going to happen, but if vehicle prices are suddenly going to be climbing, people that are, were thinking they might want to buy a car, they may put it off. My old car is doing well enough, I'm just going to fix it rather than spend the extra money on a new car. So I think, I would agree that the sales are not going to climb.
Is that what happened in January sales? Because January sales were up.
January sales are going to be up by all accounts.
So did people say, I was going to buy a car this summer, but you know what, I'm going to buy it now versus when these things happen?
They think there was some pull ahead. That seems to be it. But
see
next week, John, we'll be really smart. We'll be able to say, those guys didn't know what they're talking about. They're on fire.
Real good.
And next week's show will be all about, well, not all about EVs, but we're going to have Mike Colias, who wrote a book about EVs, who will be on the show.
Yeah.
And
we'll know a little bit more about what happened with the tariffs by then. But one thing's for sure, man, this business, sir, is not easy. But Perry Stern, thanks so much for coming in. Paul Eichenberg, so great to have you back on the show.
Thank you.
Gary, I'll see you next week, and I hope all of you join us then.
AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.